system.
Let me ask you about the issue of bailouts, because Hank Paulson, who served in the Bush administration, as you know, saying that the bailouts of the Wall Street banks saved us from the abyss of economic collapse. The Obama administration argues that its bailout of Chrysler and GM saving jobs in Detroit. What's your argument against those bailouts?
Well, in a way, they're right, but at whose expense? At the expense of the people who lost their houses and lost their jobs and are suffering. Yes, they saved the depression and harm and some suffering on Wall Street, but they needed to go bankrupt. The companies that were broke, they should go into bankruptcy and the good assets bought up instead of dumped on the taxpayers. So these banks and all that were making money off these derivatives, we ended up owning those because they're in the they've been bought up by the Federal Reserve to the tune of trillions of dollars, which again diluted the value of the money. They created the money out of thin air. So they're right. Wall Street, the big banks, and some of these corporations would have had a tougher time, but they never got hurt. They were saved. And for instance, the car companies, they protected, the labor funds more than the regular investors. So the people who had invested in the companies lost everything, but because the way the administration designed it, the bonds held by the labor unions, they were protected. So it's always special interests. Either big labor or big corporations benefit to the expense of the average person who is still suffering. And even today, on the statistics and what we're reading and hearing about, the economy keeps getting weaker, and they act like they're surprised. But if they admit that we got in this trouble by spending too much and borrowing too much and taxing too much and printing too much, how can we get out of it by doing exactly the same? They said, well, interest rates were held too low too long, and that's why Greenspan got us into this trouble. So what are they doing? Lowering them even further to actually minus now. It's negative interest rates because we're practically zero and inflation's at 4 or 5%. So it's negative interest rates. And they think that's the solution. It isn't the solution. It perpetuates the problem. That's why the predictions, once again by Austrian economists 3 years ago, said, what you're doing is wrong. You're going to prolong the agony. Now we're into it 3 years, going on 4 years. And the economy is actually getting weaker. So we're working on trying to compete with the depression of the 1930s the way we're operating right now.
So what is your current assessment of Ben Bernanke? What kind of a job is he doing?
Well, I guess from their viewpoint, if you're a money manager, I mean, he probably manages the money like all other central bankers would. But from somebody who believes that nobody can do it, he's just an average central banker and they manipulate, but he's a lot more determined than some. I would say that his approach and determination to inflate regardless, they even kid about him. He says, if you need to, we'll drop the money out of the helicopters if necessary. Just inflate, inflate, inflate. Compared to Paul Volcker, in 1979, we had high inflation rates, and he said, we have to save the dollar and we have to save the economy. He took interest rates up to 20%. So he was one that was forced to restrain. So his approach was different. But I try very hard, even though I end up doing it, criticizing the very central bankers. I criticize the system more than anything because they're trying to manage an unmanageable system, and the flaw is that they trust that system, and they're not capable of doing it. They just don't have the information. Only the market knows what the interest rates should be, because if they lower the interest rates for the banks and they benefit, if you have somebody that's elderly and trying to save money, the market rate of a CD should be maybe 6 or 7%. They get 1 or 2%. So they get cheated. So it's a very unfair system, and there's no way, no matter how well intended they are, and basically I'm sure they're well intended, they can't manage it because it's a deeply flawed system.
So should we go back to the gold standard?
I don't use those words, but the Constitution says we can have only gold and silver as legal tender, and that hasn't been repealed. Much of what I have written about, like and the Fed, the book I wrote on and the Fed, I don't think we need that. But I always say that the transition should be more gradual. So I'm not for closing closing the Fed down as much as allowing competition, legalizing the competition in the currencies, and that is to allow people to use gold and silver and legalize the Constitution. And then if the Fed fails, as I suspect they will, there will be a currency in place. But there were flaws in the gold standard in the 19th century, and we can learn from it. So I like to think about going forward to a commodity standard of money with competition, and this is something that Hayek taught, and he was one of the Austrian economists.
Liberty Defined is your latest book. How many have you written, by the way?
Well, I guess it depends on how you count them. There were a lot of little pamphlets that I've written. I would say books of that size, maybe 5.
So you write about 50 essential freedoms. Take one or two from this book that you think are essential for the U.S.
Well, personal liberty, and I talk about that a lot. You know, not repealing the Fourth Amendment, not dealing with, not allowing the Patriot Act out of this sense of insecurity to give up on our personal privacy. So I talk a lot about that. To protect liberties, you have to keep the government small, and one of the greatest incentives for the growth of government is a military operation. When we are constantly at war, government gets bigger and people are more likely to sacrifice their liberties. And I also talk a whole lot about the monetary issue as well. And it's the rejection. I recognize, when you talk about liberty, I recognize our life and liberty come to us in a natural way and not from our government. But what we have to do in order to preserve that is we have to reject any personal or governmental use of force. You know, government can't come in and, from our viewpoint, and use force because we think we know how to make you behave better, or we think you know how we should teach you how to raise your children, something like that. So you never use force. Individuals can't use force. Governments can't use force. In our day and age, we still recognize that people can't hurt other people and you can't steal from other people, but we say the government can redistribute wealth and it's perfectly okay. Well, he needs something, and so it invites this entitlement system, and that becomes, you know, what people believe is freedom. They have a right to entitlements, and that's completely wrong, because if you believe in a free society, it's the opposite, no coercion, and we wouldn't use coercion to tell other countries what to do. And we're always telling other countries what to do, and if they don't do what we say, we bomb them. So that's the kind of thing that we'd like to stop.
You've said in the past that you don't like labels, but you've been described as a libertarian, as a Republican, as a conservative. How would you describe yourself?